يخستيني اشتكت يوهان taakw.eetí ḵuwuligáasʼ gwalkiwe. Echwasakut su tleid daakach satan. Gwal tleidihin, gwal dachdihin. Atlein tleid ḳuhá. Ullashla. Ya hatlatki kach. Yechwaji ya qonei aya adati haschi qonei. Shit kakuu. We qaaw aya qayaw. Qunachawi haqiyaki ya Lingít. Dakqa Lingít qa eilka Lingít. Hatwasagu wan qanin swush de seqin yitusani. Ya haat khaayi. Dakqa aayí yati. Watsich qadzisk. Akha we Lingít Aaní. Ziskaya tlelqusti. Gwal qeeq. Gwal tlaq aan. Atlein aqwa dakqa. Watsich just dakqa. Tawe dakqa aayí. Janmu qa Lingít Lingít. Ya shashakikaya an qanin ziyaw tuwatlaq. Qaquwakan. Aayí hasyati. Tsa. Saak. Yaw. Khat aya yaw qadaqqatsu. Dakqa Lingít. Ch'aak. Adehasullagaas'n. Ya away echwaji. Ya atlein ḳu'u. Ya wasandu asak. Nas. Hin tlein aya nas. Aqayaq aya hasullagaasʼ. Ch'aak. Ya hashilko has. Aqa away qonei has wudza'an. Ya an qallaqu qa'a. Aqa daqqade hasullagaasʼ. Kutaksakshawi aayí haswuti. Atlein taak. Ch'aak away aayí haswutiin. Aqa away wananisawi. Ya an qallaqu. Witatsu. Yan uwasla. Aqa away hastituasagu daqqade haswuati. Ye awa hastituye wuti aya niche. Aqa away qonei eilkade haswuat. Yeq haswuat. Has aw satin qa'a. Sit klein. Qudaqlidzi aya aqanaq awuati. Ajawe adatyu hasqawla atgan. Ch'aak. Wasa atka qwanei. Dakhnaq shawat. Shuqa'a. Hastu sai awe. Awase. Qaquwatsich. Yewe ye hasyawa qayan. Kagachtu aaq. Sit tayide. Haguchlahash. Ye awe sit. Wehin atayi chawe kawada. We qu'u gwallasu twa oshkuun. Ya shawat tlesha twa oshku. Akawa khilshani atta de haswuati. Ya shtakat hat tla hasyana nakhuzati. Ya Lingít sati. Ye awe datyu hasqawla atqa. Heshwasaka kwati. Gallituasagu Kayaaní. Ye awa qanas hasawliyech. Sit tayich haswullahash. She aya hastu kak adat awe has adawa ach. Yes yawa qa. Gwal ye awa yinuk yinde awe we she. Yinde yanas tashatoashku we sit. Aqait aya ilahashi. Hase yawa tlaq aqa eilhini ade haswuquchen. Atlein ḳuhá sit taayí ḥuwuligáasʼ. Achu atlell hasú tuaisgo. Claic a dachaway out tut le chéil. A gá dachté hasú á. Haswud za anan teag. Déislín na tasahín. Gá atlein. Eil cáisling gid chá atlein an ḳuwuligáasʼ. Ye a wet at gikach. The cut ye de hasyaw sa duck. Atlein nach sa tí chud sa tí wega. Gonna cheese isa achi gonna cheese. Okay. 7 minutes of Lingít. 7 minutes, that was good. We'll do a little, well, I guess, what all did you catch? Anybody catch anything? And I'm not asking anybody to translate, just little things here and there.
Deer and mountain goat?
Yeah, deer, mountain goat. Yeah, away. Yeah, away.
Clouds and rivers, clouds
Yeah.
and water.
Water.
Did I hear something about a dugout and an eagle?
Well, a long time ago, and then a raft, actually. There was a raft.
Talked a little bit about herring and Sitka.
Yep. Yeah, well, goodness, cheese. Yeah, so I was just talking about springtime. Maybe springtime has arrived. Taakw.eetí ḵuwuligáasʼ. Maybe the spring has arrived. And I say, I don't know how many times it's gonna snow. Maybe once, maybe twice. But you never know, too. One time I planned a class and well, spring, it ended in May, so we'll go harvest medicines on the last day of class, and we got 2 feet of snow that day, so we kind of abandoned the plan. But then I started talking springtime. Pretty soon they're going to be going and working on herring eggs. They might already be. So ḳuwuligáasʼ is the name for herring eggs. Yao is the name for herring. And it's kind of like a new year for Tlingit people. I think a new year is sort of like when those foods really start coming back. And the birds are just going crazy, and everybody's putting trees in the water to get their herring eggs and on kelp and everything else. Ḳuwuligáasʼ is what it's called. And then there's different ways to talk about being on the kelp or the tree. There's this hairy seaweed. And then I started talking about how Tlingit peoples, a lot of them just really love herring eggs, and it's just all part of this food cycle. Even people who are from the interior really like it. There was this one elder, she was just so much fun. I was talking about her in another class this week. And if you didn't speak Tlingit, you'd probably say, boy, that lady never talks. But if and that's what I thought. She just came down with this other elder I knew, and we were talking about this too, how are they so productive? They're 80 years old, just making piles of moccasins to bring down to sell in Skagway. And then we're talking about the foods they put up and just how much every day they were just working. So they come down and sell moccasins, and I talk to one of them all the time, and I've just known her a long time, and we just love to visit and speak Tlingit. And the other one, she just never really said anything. I was like, yeah, it's fine, One of them does all the talking, I guess, all the lead negotiator. And I was walking them to their car, and then to the one that never really said anything. Her name was Shuwateen, Martha Van Heel. Very nice, super nice. And then I just said, and I said, I'm thankful to have seen you. It's good that you came down here. And then she stopped and just turned and just started speaking Tlingit, very fast. And she was telling me where her family was and where she grew up, and who her dad was and who her mom was and where they came from. I mean, she just it was like the waterfall just turned on. I had to, and I remember this was decades ago. So I had to really sort of make my whole body go still so I could just focus and listen. Because I think as you're learning Tlingit, and then sometimes you encounter this long string of it, it could challenge your brain because you've been doing little chunks all the time, like little chunk here, little chunk here. And all of a sudden you're sort of, it's like I asked this guy in Hawaii, he's like, how'd you learn how to swim? He's like a Hawaiian guy. It's like, oh, my dad took me out on a boat on the ocean, just threw me off. I was like, okay. So sometimes we go for the deep water stuff, but nobody's going to drown. Everyone's going to be okay. So then I started talking about how we like to trade things all the time, people from the inland and people from the coast. Because one time I brought her up because I saw her at Celebration. This might have been 6, 8 years ago. And I was really happy to see her. So I said, it's good to see you. She says, who are you? She says, who are you? I said, I said, my name is Rene. I know you and you know me. She says, KTOO. I said, ijite. So then she says, do you have herring eggs? And I said, yeah, I'll get you some. And so it was a really fun conversation because as soon as she's like, oh, I know him, he'll give me some food. And so, but then I started talking about there's things that are in the interior that aren't here, like caribou, moose. Although there's moose, you can access moose from cake, and you can access moose from Yakutat, and you can access moose sometimes from Héens, but there's a lot of them in the interior, and also mountain sheep, which you don't really have on the coast. And then on the coast, though, you have seal and herring, and then you have hooligan. But the fish, the salmon, they go up the big rivers as well. So then I started, like one thought leading to another was saying the Tlingit peoples, they lived inland and on the coast. So Hka is the coast. It means on the salt water. So sometimes you would hear elders say, we're saltwater people. And that's because we say Hka Tlingit. And then Dakka is in the interior. Dakka Tlingit. And so that's a real distinction, those who are inland and those who are on the coast. And you see similar things with the Inupiaq people. So the people of Anaktuvik Pass just have a different lifestyle than those who are living in Uktiagvik because the ocean just sort of gives you different life, right? So then I started thinking, well, maybe I should talk about this. So a long time ago, I believe the Tlingit people come to the coast along this river called Nas Hini. People call it the Nas River. There's some things that give this sound, which is fine, but doesn't exist in Tlingit. Like a lot of people who live up the Taakw River call it taakw, especially in Canada. There's this kind of a slight change to that a vowel that happens. But all those words, like these are English words, bat, rat, sat, hat, cat, like that sound does not exist in Tlingit. So, if you catch yourself making that sound, like bring out our at-oo. Well, you can just shift it a little bit closer to a u. Bring out our at-oo. And so, anyways, so the Nas is, I think, where the Tlingit first migrated to the coast. Well, probably 20,000 years ago or something. And then they start to settle, and then this big flood happens. So there's this verb I was using, ḵuwuligáasʼ, and it means to migrate. So the verb is to house post, like the post in it to build a house, and it's also the name for a carving that could go on a house post. So gas is a house post. Kutia is a totem pole. One's inside, one's outside. And so ḵuwuligáasʼ is to house post, but that's the word for like we're picking up, we're going to live somewhere else. There's other ones, like you could say Anchqaltsu is the name of a place that's briefly been known as Akrek, Anchqaltsu, and that name means the village that migrates temporarily. And so there is another word to migrate, which means like we're going to go here for the summer, but then we'll come back here. And then that one has a verb root, which comes from like carrying a bunch of stick-like objects, because you used to take a lot of the old houses, you would take the planks off the side in the summertime, and then you would go and build a fish camp out of the planks from the clan house. Then you come back and you put them back on. And most people lived outside of the main houses the whole summer. You're just out putting up foods and just sort of living your summer life. So then this flood happens, and so people go to the interior, and they live there for a long time, long time. And then the flood subsides, and then they decide to go back to the coast, because even though they've been there for probably 100 generations or so, it's still in the coast is still in their mind, it's in their memory. So they decide to head back, and then they hit this big glacier, and then there was a river going under it, and it was too big for everybody to go over, and they're trying to figure out what to do. And there's these two women named aayí and ḵuwuligáasʼ who said, we'll go under, we'll go under it. And everybody said, no, 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 too dangerous, too dangerous. And we don't, Tlingit people, we don't like our mothers and our aunties to go towards danger. That's the job of the men. Was something might kill you, you send a guy, because we get our whole lineage through our mothers, so we protect that lineage by, sending the guys out. And then, but they talked about it, and they said, well, maybe it's going to be okay. If that's what you want to do, then okay. And so they built a raft, and they tied these spruce boughs, branches, to their head. And they said, if you feel this go down, duck, because you're going to smash in that glacier. We don't want that. And it's scary. But they went under this glacier. It was all dark, to go under a glacier on a raft. But they made it. So then they start building all these rafts and sending people under. They composed these 2 songs about it. And then, but some of the people said, nah, we don't want to do that. It's scary. Scary going under a glacier. So they stayed. And then they formed these communities, Teslin and Carcross and Atlin, which we call Dísi, and Natasaheen and Aatlain. And then the others came, and then they started to form, like all these clans started breaking out, and all these groups started forming. But I think they all trace themselves back to these key migrations. So that's what I was talking about. Any thoughts, questions, language things you've been thinking of?
Could you say the word for raft again?
Ḳuhá.
Oh, no, that's cheese.
Okay. Well, I thought we'd start looking at some names of communities. Let me make this bigger on my screen. So it would say Lingít Aaní, saax'ú. So this is the plural form of, it's a plural possessed form of names. We might talk about that stuff a little bit today. So Lingít Aaní means, I think it means like Tlingit villages. And so on, I interpret as a village or community. So if you said, Ha'ani de nach tuchuch, if you said, let's go by boat to our land, you said Ha'ani de, I would assume we're going to your village. Ha'atki would be our land. So the soil, the sort of, more of a concept of like a nation, Ha'atki. There's this, I just ran into this one elder years ago who just started talking about that, and I know it's on the phone. She's like, call me on the phone, and she'll want to talk about that. So there is the community of Yakutat was a multilingual community. So was Carcross. So those were multilingual communities where you had Tlingit, and then you had other languages. So you had Tlingit and Eyak in the Yakutat area. And then you had Tlingit and Tagish in the Carcross area. And so sometimes when you go to these places and you start getting into place names, you'll find that they come from, some of them come from Eyak. And then they just sort of get shingatized, right? And this happens with lots of words. There's lots and lots of, like Watsich is the name for caribou, and that comes from another, it's a Dene language, and it's very close in, I think, Tagish and to, I know in Koyakan, I think it's Metzich. And so sometimes it'll come in and we'll say, oh, well, we don't have that sound, so we'll just make it into this other sound. And I do believe that's the case from for Yakutat and for Gashyach and for Shakha. Like, I think all three of these words probably come from other languages, and Atna people as well. So there were Eyak and Atna peoples who became Tlingit peoples, and those things happen. But anyways, the common name for this is Yakutat. Yakutat.
Yakutat.
Yakutat.
Yakutat.
And it does sound like there's a canoe in there, and so I was in Yakutat, and they were starting this canoe group because they got a canoe made and painted, wonderful looking canoe. And they said, what should we call it? And of course, we're all trying to be the quickest to the joke. Call it Yakutat, Yakutat, ḵuwuligáasʼ. The people from Yakutat around the canoe. So here's, we're just going to kind of go through these names. So this one comes from this word. I was born here, and it took me well over 40 years to figure out what the name is, because I kept hearing different things. And place names are interesting because some of them you'll hear like 5 or 6 definitions. Home of the wind, windy place, windy valley, wind off the mountain. At some point someone told me the sound of a person peeing on a rock, and I was like, what are you talking about? And then roughed up place, roughed up waters, whiteheads on the water. But I could never figure out like how would the name work though. And then a colleague of mine, Chashi Will Geiger, was listening to a recording of an elder named Mildred Sparks, and she said and place names are tricky because sometimes they'll just really condense something down, and that's what happens here. So there is this this word, it's an underlined G, then a high tone A, and then a K and a W. So it's qaq. And qaq it pops up in the Raven stories a lot. And I think it's also related to your ring finger, which is called shayaqaku. And that qaq is the hard center of a tree. They call it the heartwood, or just the core part of a tree. So that's what wushuqaku yeh refers to. Is like there's a whole bunch of trees that wash up on the beaches there, and they tend to have like a real solid core. So that's where the name comes from. And it contracts down to shqaqwe. Shqaqwe.
Shkukwe.
Shqaqwe.
Skugway.
Shqaqwe.
Skugway.
And this one, I've never heard this second, tlak'uwu'an. I've never heard that, but that's probably the uncompacted form. Tlingit loves to contract things, especially when they become names. It just tends to smush some things together. So this word tlak means, or sometimes you'll say tlagu. It means ancient or eternal. It depends how it's being used. Tlak means like all the time. So it's an eternal village. That's where the name Kluckwan comes from, and it's Kluck'an. Kluck'an.
Plakwan.
Kluck'an.
Plakwan.
Okay. And then this is day is a trail or a road or a path. Sh is the end of something. So this is the end of the trail. De sh,
Day sh.
de sh,
They should.
de sh.
They should.
And
And is Haynes just like a really bad translation, or does it mean something totally different?
it's some dude. Just took it, very common. Like, we'll name this after this dude. And we don't, I think if you took like 3,000 documented Tlingit place names, there's only maybe 3 or 4 where they named it after a person. Usually go the other way around. Like, this is, especially in when they started to give them English names, like, this is Taku Jim, and this is, whatever. Then they give them a name based on the place, but yeah. What's that?
Xuhá. This totally transforms my understanding of what Skagway, where the word comes from. And so is this the definition you're printing? My grandmother was born there. So is this the definition you're running with now in the texts?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And
I used
sorry.
I used to say something different because that's what I could find, was that it was roughed up water or bunched up water. But then once I heard Wushikaku, yeah, I could see it, and I could see it in the Tlingit now. So
Yeah, it changes a lot. I heard home of the north wind, something along those lines too.
yeah, I probably made 10 signs up there, and we're like, we gotta change all these signs. They're like, you know, I was like, well, how it goes.
Yeah. So yeah, wow. Yeah, this and Klagu on where does that come from? And is that something to use or not?
Yeah.
Or never
Yes.
heard that.
Let's jump to let me pull it up real quick. So in thinking about, there's some time references that go on here. And I'm going to zoom in on this thing. So when we think about time, so right now is yidat. And you can also, like, direction and location is really interesting in Tlingit. I think it is. Because day is towards, dach is from. So you go day, dach, day, dach, day, dach. And those are suffixes that attach directly to a noun. So if this is a house, hit day, hit dach, hit day, hit dach. To the house, away from the house, to the house, away from the house. But you can also use those for time references. So you could say yidat, and that could change to yidati Tlingit, the people of today. And you could say yidati dach from now on, and yidati day up until now. So it can go towards a time and away from a time. So we're just going to go backwards. So a little while ago, or everybody just say yidat,
Yidat.
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 A little while ago, ziyak,
Yak.
Yak.
ziyak.
Ziyak.
Ziak.
Yesterday, tatke,
Tatke.
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 The other day, kliatke,
Tliat.
Kliatke.
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 Tliat.
Kliatke.
And there's some really interesting things going on here, which is like kliya is sort of like farther down. That's really kind of what it means. So you could say kliya, this one that's farther down, like you're talking about. Is it this house? No, it's this one farther. Kliya hastuhiti, the house is farther down. So then you have like a farther down yesterday and a farther down month. The word for moon and for month are the same. And then for women who have their cycle, it's called disnigu, like feeling the moon is what it kind of means. And so after the other month, kliyadis,
Qiadis.
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 This.
Any guesses on what this one's going to be?
Yeah, taakw.
Last year.
The other year. Yeah. So like it's the other year. So like it gets a little bit confusing when you start saying like this year, last year, the other year, but this is going like several years back usually. Qiatak.
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 So then this gets us to these two, and someone thought they were hearing eagle, chalk, but it's chalk. So
Chalk.
soft CW. Chalk.
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 Taakw.
So these two concepts, we'll do this one, and then we'll say this one, then I'll talk about what they are. Clock.
Chalk.
Laak.
Clock.
Chalk.
Lingít used to use a lunar calendar. I don't know nothing about lunar calendars, and I barely keep up with any calendar. But they did follow the moon, and then every moon had a name, like a series of moons, right? And so it did follow a lunar calendar. I think there used to be a name a long time ago for a 13th month, but now it's just called Dísi, the 13th month, right? And I'm like, Okay, so these two are closely related, and here's how I think they work. So this is a long time ago, but it can also mean for a long time. It depends how it's being used. If it just starts things out, aayí, long time ago we were there. But you could say we were there for a long time. It depends how it's being used. When I first hear it, I think a long time ago. And then clock is way long time ago. And here's how I think it roughly works. This is everything from, and it depends. Sometimes you're laughing, you're like, oh yeah, pre-pandemic, and someone's like, chalk, it was a long time ago. We've been pandemicking for a long time. But I think the difference between these two is people collectively have some sort of concrete memory of it. Even like we were there, we went down this river, they could still get some details of the thing. Everything where the details are lost, but we know it happens, is from here back. Yeah, there were mammoths. We were hanging out with them. Yeah, there were these saber-toothed tigers. Yeah, there was this big flood, but we don't know a lot of details about it. We just know it happened and it pushed people inland. So that becomes clock. And there are some, and so this is long, ancient time ago, but there's also, it can also mean forever. And it gets shortened a little bit. So you go cluck when you say cluck. And those are related words, like so long ago no one can remember it, and then all the time. And that's where the name Kayaaní comes from.
Sheesh.
Ah,
Can I ask another quick question?
ah.
Was there a Tlingit settlement at Daeshu before contact?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
I'm just curious.
And with a lot of this too, it's interesting to think about how to do this, because we would call the whole area from basically what is now Héen all the way almost down to Berners Bay and way up a little bit past Skagway. That would all be called Ḳuhá. So that's how the concept of like land would work for us, is that whole area is called Ḳuhá. Then you have small areas within there. Like Héen that's a big area. Juneau is a big area. So for example, the whole Juneau area you would call Ḵuwuligáasʼ, right? Or ḵuwuligáasʼ, ḵuwuligáasʼ. And that would refer to this whole area. And then you would have place names within that are pretty small areas. But it could be a river. It could be a whole mountain. But yeah, and then there's a whole bunch of place names the primary settlement was probably at Chilkoot. So on Chilkoot Lake is where a lot of people lived, but you did have people who lived all places from there going all the way up the river. You had several communities going up the Chilkat River, and then Tla'aquan, at the time of contact, might have been the largest community, probably about 10,000 people who lived in that area. So it was
Seriously?
yeah, it was a big, big place.
Oh,
But that's what
is
you had big communities, and you had pretty small ones in between there and what is now Haines.
is there what? Just curious what the data is for that. Is it archaeological or just oral history or?
Sort of like people who come and then they sort of take note of what these communities were like when they were exploring them. And people didn't go up there for a long time because I think early explorers, when they went up in that area, some of them didn't come back, I think. So it took them a long time to sort of get up there and start. But people were trading and doing stuff with them. So
Yeah. So George Davidson wasn't the first. I'm trying to think who would be the first explorer that we know of
it's a
doing
good question. I know Emmons was up there. He was up there, and there's a pretty neat story because when he went up, there's these kind of two closely related stories, which I don't know them that well, but there was a leader up there. I think his name was Shadechicht, but maybe it was a different one. No, it was a different one. I had his name, but they call it Koklux, is what they say in English. And so he and Emmons made a trade. So Emmons traded him something from their boat, and then the leader from Tla'aquan had several wives, and they were very skilled, and they drew a map from Tla'aquan to Tla'ax'ú, and so they drew it, and it was really interesting because then you could see like how Tlingit people thought of the land, and so they traded this map for this piece of the ship. And then while they were there meeting, there was an eclipse. And Tlingit, an eclipse a long time ago was awful scary for Tlingit people. Nora Dowenhauer had a poem about her grandfather, and there was an eclipse, so he put all his best clothes on and he stood up on a rock. He said, "Well, if I can get turned to stone, I want to look good." And so that was the thought. Was like we used to think there was a bunch of stuff that was going to turn us to stone. Looking at Raven, the eclipse. And so, and then if you go up to Dry Bay, you'll see people that have been turned to stone. There was a guy walking his dog. There was a boat full of Russians that tried to go to Raven's house. Yeah. So I think that's a pretty early contact up in that area, but there might have been someone else before.
So did Emmons have any reports on population there? Or
Probably.
probably. Okay.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
so
just curious.
the Tlingit Indians is probably his kind of landmark text. It was finished by Frederica de Laguna. Big book. If you can get it, it's pretty good. And some of this stuff too, like all of them, I think were pretty. Whenever you read this stuff, just be ready for some racism, because they're going to talk about like there's just a lot of judgment in some of these texts. I think Emmons was kind of bad. I think there were others who were way worse. And we're having conversations now about like, why are we still quoting this stuff? Because I was reading this other text and they're like, yeah, they were real savages. I was like, what the heck? Why are we gonna talk like that? And so, but I still think it's really worth like taking a look at. And he did try to write down a lot of Tlingit. So like he tried to get the words like. So he could probably speak some Tlingit just based on how much stuff he was able to write down and talk about. But I think as far as accurate writing of Tlingit, the first you get of that is Louis Shotridge.
Prestige.
Before you move away from time, just the difference between taakw and taakw. You said, so I understood the difference between clock and taakw but what would be more of a concrete difference between ḵuhá or ḵuwuligáasʼ and taakw? Would it be like generations ago would be chalk, or like 40, 50 years ago?
I think this is probably less than 10.
Ah,
I think if it starts to get more than 10, you start to move into chalk territory. And so even like it's not that long ago, but I think once we go back more than 10 years, it does, like even if you think as an individual, and everybody's memory works different, but I think it starts to run together once you go from like 10 years to 15 years, 15, and I can't imagine being like 90 and like having all these like wild memories about stuff. And so and then there's some other phrases like taakw. So taakw is also related to this, but it means like an ancient thing, but it could also mean kind of run down. It kind of depends, and it's also a bit of an expression to say like, "Oh my." Um, but yeah, that's the difference between those. And then we can go this way too, which so from yidet, this is kind of a real interesting thing. So if you look at ziyak and ziyagan, they're very close. Ziyak is a little while ago. Ziyagan is a little while from now. And so this means it certainly happened today, but it was a little while ago. And it's probably going to be today, but it might be a little while. So we also have these pretty fluid concepts of like time. And then you also have siqan or siqanan. I hear both. I kind of prefer siqanan for tomorrow. And then you could do other stuff too. You could say like 5 days will pass, 5 days have passed, 6 months ago. Like you can do all that stuff, but then you got to start introducing verbs. And some of these things, the main ones you're going to use is yawachi, which is for a day to pass. It could also mean like sort of like going to camp somewhere or something. And then the other one is shuahich. So shuahich is for something to come to an end. So shuahich literally means it ran to its end. So it could mean died off, and it could mean other things like that, but it could just mean for time to pass. So you say dech tak shuahich, 2 years passed. And whether we're talking about a narrative, like something happened here, this amount of time passed, and this other thing happened, or you could say dech tak shuahichin aayí. It's been 2 years since we were there. And let me put the I had a thought, so let me put I'll put a link to that Emmons text in here as well. Okay. So let's get back to some of these places. So for Huna, this name comes from two things. The north wind is called Héen. 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 Then there's this concept that you're going to see kind of all over the place in Tlingit. And I think a long time ago, you would say this word as nya. So there's this sound, It's like an N sound that kind of goes through the nose. That sound is kind of gone from almost every Tlingit community, except for Teslin, Carcross, and Cluckwan. So this sound used to be in Tlingit, and it kind of fell out of Tlingit. So now this word becomes either niya or yina. And you'll see it all over the place, niya and yina. For example, the people of Prince of Wales were called Henya, which is Heen Nya, near the water. And then the people from the kind of Wrangell, Petersburg area were collectively called Sanya. Well, I think no, a little further south of Yakutat, sorry, south of Wrangell. So that's Sa, which is southward, Nya area. So it could mean in the area of, but it could also mean sheltered from. So it kind of depends on how it's being used. So the shelter from the north wind, you get Hun Nya. When you put them together, it contracts to Hunna. Hunna.
Hunna.
Hunna.
Hunna.
And some people do say Hunniya. Hunniya.
Yeah.
And there is another name for the community. Tak means next to. There's a clan called Tak Dane Tan. It has to do with a house that was built right next to another house. So the people of the house next to it. And in this case, Gao is a drum, or time. In this case, it's a drum. Tak, next to. An, village next to the drum. Gao tak an.
On.
Gao tak an.
On.
For Sitka, there is an island called Shi. It has been, there's this, I was reading this letter on Haida Gwaii, and I think if I understand it right, they had these wonderful ceremonies where they wrote, they put the name, like, for example, would write down the name Haynes and would carve this really nice bentwood box. And then that was given, the bentwood box was given from the Haida people to the Canadian government with this colonial name and say, we're going to give this name back to you folks. And then they publish this big thing of the Haida names for their communities. And then they say briefly known as, briefly known. And so it was really, really, I love that idea. So this island has briefly been known as Baranof Island. The island is called Shi. It's linked to a story with the volcano that's called ḵuhá, which has been briefly known as Mount Edgecombe. ḵuhá, and then there was a lady who did something with this volcano. Her name was Shi. And so that's an instance where maybe the name and the person are the same, but it's actually a particular person from a long, long time ago story. So this island is called Shi. Then this other word is tika. The I gets contracted out of there. Tika. Oops, I forgot that. I'm missing a. Okay. So tika means on the outskirts of, or out on the water. Like the name really comes from a whole bunch of little islands that are on that, just a little bit off the coast. And so it's talking about those little islands that are there. If you're ever in Sitka and you look out and see a whole bunch of those little islands, that's the reason it has this name. So the name itself in Tlingit is Sheetka. 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 And so the apostrophe is right there after the T. A bunch of times I'll catch myself saying sheetka, but it's sheetka. The word is lake. This K at the end, this sound, makes things small. So it's a little lake. So this would be one that I think would be pretty easy to revert back to Tlingit because it's called Auk Lake. So instead of calling it that, everybody could just call it Auk,
Ak.
Auk,
Ak.
Auk,
Ak.
Auk.
Ak.
And this little W at the end It's like you're out of breath and you're trying to blow out this little tiny candle. There's this little puff of air with your lips sort of like that, and then that's how it ends. For this one, I do believe it comes from king salmon and cove. There are several words in Tlingit to talk about a body of water on the ocean, like a bay and a cove or a bight, and then a fjord. I think those are the three main kind of categories in Tlingit. So a big wide open bay is, I'll put it in the chat. I'll put these three in the chat. Wait, I gotta type them outside. Okay. So these are these are related things. Actually, yeah. Okay. So you have this one is what in English would be a bay, and this one in English I think would be a cove or a bight, and this one in English, well, I guess it's not English, but it'd be a fjord. So it's got long, kind of long with narrow sides, and sometimes steep sides. So these are the three ways to talk about like a type of a bay, basically. So this first one is qay,
Kay.
qay,
Kay.
or qay,
Kay.
qay. So this one, the A to the E sound, that is a big dialect difference for Tlingit. What we call like Greater Northern Tlingit, Skagway, Juneau, Hoonah, a whole bunch of communities in that area, Sitka, they would make an A sound for a lot, not every time, but there's this whole set of words. And then southern places like Prince of Wales, Ketchikan, Wrangell, and then also Cake, and then also inland places like Teslin would make the E sound. So this is a big dialect thing, is the vowels. But that literally means like between the folds of something. Like you've got two things that stick up and there's something in between them. So in the fort would be nu qay. Qanachan is a fence. So the word for yard is qanachan qay, between the fences. And then j is your arm or your hand. And the crook of your arm is called jqay, between the folds of the arm. So you'll see this word kind of tucked into a bunch of different things. This one is q, q,
Uh.
q,
Uh.
and that is a cove or a bight. And then you'll see this, and you'll see this one in place names, like kind of tucked into place names. And then you'll see this one also in place names. And also this one pops up in a bunch of clan names, like Qa-nach-ati, Qa-nach-teeti, Tuk-nach-ati, Tsik-nach-ati. So that nach pops up right there. So this one is nach,
Nach.
nach,
Nach.
nach.
No.
And these are ones I think once you start learning place names, you'll see them just kind of around. So when you add q to ta, you get q,
Ah.
q,
Ku.
q.
Ku.
Now that's gonna be a bit of an ask to have people go from taakw to taakw. But I do think it can happen. Right. So you get the ta on there and the q. When a word ends with a short high vowel, like king salmon is ta. When you put something on there, whether it's a suffix or you're making a compound word, a lot of times it's going to push that vowel to go long and low. So ta goes to ta, ta, q. So here's a village or land, and then goon is a portage. So it's a piece of land that connects, two pieces of land, I guess. So this one is on goon.
On goon.
On goon.
On goon.
On goon.
On goon.
So another example of how ah switches to ah. So that people say angoon, on goon.
On
On goon.
Qiqeh is the mouth of the dawn, like when the sun just breaks the horizon. And that's what I heard where this name comes from, for the village of Cake, which, again, we see the EE. Northern Tlingit would say Qeeq. They would say Qeeq, Qeeq. But in Cake, people say Qeeq,
Ich,
Qeeq,
ich,
Qeeq. And they used to have very long ku'ik there, go for days. So they got the reputation of the village that never sleeps, which is, this is a klesh contracted to just the letter L. So that pushes a verb to go negative, right? So you could say klesh chosaku, I don't know. Klesh ushke, it's bad. And in this case, without this underline X, if that just became a W, that means plural people to sleep. There's a whole bunch of verbs you're going to run into that change if you're talking about one person doing it or more than one. Sleeping is one of them. So one person is ta, multiple people is kheu. So if you're telling one kid to go to bed, nata. If you're telling all them kids to go to bed, nai kheu. Go sleep, everybody. But this is the village that never sleeps, and it's ḵuhá. 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 And well, end there because I think they get the trophy for the two most difficult. Like you're like being like some explorer. Hey, what do you guys call this place? Well, some people call it Qeeq, but you can also call it ḵuhá if you want to.
No one leaves a party until everyone says it correctly.
That's right. This party never ends. Goodness, sheesh. And to read more about Nora Dowenhauer and the eclipse, it's from one of her books of poetry. And then there's also, I think if you just did an internet search for Nora Dowenhauer and eclipse, you would find her reading her poem. I also made a video about her and Richard. It's a long documentary about them, but at some point in that documentary, she reads her poetry, so several times. But then there's a pretty long one with Kathy Ruddy and her talking about the eclipse and Emmons and all this stuff. They kind of summarize quite a bit of it. It's pretty fun. It was this little narrow strip of land all around the world, like something like 14 miles wide, and it just happened to hit that place where they were gathering together. It's pretty wild. Cheers, Johan. You wish
Sheesh.
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 Ah.
Sheesh.
I would forget
Sheesh.
the Zoom that never ends. We have to come up with a word for that.
Shoo hee hee zoom. Shoo hee hee zoom. The zoom never ends. But it's over right now.
Hey, Cheryl,
Yes.
you want to call me?
Yeah, sure. That sounds great. And just know there's something messed up with my Zoom that I cannot leave Zoom meetings. It won't let me leave. And it's kind of funny because we have a joke in our family that we're always the last leavers, like any social gathering, we're the last leavers. And it is, my husband is like this, Darren's super social. But now I've become the last leaver for every Zoom to the point that it's totally awkward. So
It's okay.
It's okay. Renee.
I'll push end.
Okay, sounds good.
Bye.